Hi everyone. We're going to start. Sorry, we're going to start now. Could everyone be quiet, please? Thank you. We're going to get started for the first scrutiny of 2024. Going to hand over to Alice first of all for apologies.
Thank you. No apologies, but Councillor Douglas has informed us that he needs to leave at about 7:15, so apologies for missing the latter half of the meeting.
And does anyone have any declarations of interest? No? Excellent. Chair's announcements. This isn't a real announcement, but just to say that there is a lot on the agenda this evening, and that probably the last item in particular, there's likely to be a lot of questions on. So if we could perhaps try to be as concise and succinct as possible on the first three items, just to make sure that we've got the time that we need on that final one. So yeah, I will move on to looking at minutes. Are we happy to approve minutes of 4th of December? And if so, I can propose that they're approved. And someone happy to second that? Yeah, Chris. And then we just need to vote on that if we're happy to approve them. Great. Just to let you all know, we have a request from a member of the public to speak on the leisure management contract report. And that person is going to speak immediately before we consider that item. So we're going to do a little bit of the rejigging of the agenda. So we're going to take item 8, which is the private renter sector policies first. And then we are going to go on to the DAHA accreditation item. Then we'll do the draft corporate strategy, and then we'll do the leisure management contract. And then we will go back to all of the things like the work plan that we probably don't need officers and other people here for. So is everyone happy with that order? Cool, excellent, thanks. In that case, we'll move on to the first item we're going to look at, which is private renter sector regulation policies, results of consultation. We have Linda Smith, David Butler and Gail Siddle here. And I think perhaps you're all online. Yeah. So please feel free to introduce the report when you're ready.
Yeah, in the interest of brevity, I'll let Gail or David introduce the report, and I'll just listen to what fellow councillors have got to say. Thank you.
And I'm going to give Gail.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. This report is really formalising the policies and the procedures that we are already using for regulation of the private rented sector. This is how shall I put it? This is when things are really bad, when we start using financial penalties, banning orders, and declaring somebody not being fit and proper. It's therefore only right that these policies are transparent and they have been out to consultation. And we've received 55 responses to that consultation, which has surprised me. But there is definitely interest out there for these sort of, for these policies. The biggest part of feedback that we got was that they welcomed the opportunity to put their comments through, did the majority of landlords, and that they were transparent and clear. And they cover, like I say, the fit and proper person declarations that we have to make if somebody has, for instance, been found to have committed a criminal offence or fraud. The banning orders, where sometimes we have the discretionary power to apply for a banning order, and the entrance onto the rogue landlord database. Plus the other policy, which is the financial penalties policy, which has been upgraded quite considerably because of recent case law and just good practice after being used for since 2017. So it was something that I felt personally that we should be reviewing, and it came at the right time to get it back to Cabinet for them to actually have a look at it. So that's why we brought them to Cabinet, and we are going to bring them to Cabinet next week for approval of the updated policies.
Thanks, Gail. Are we happy to go on to questions now? I think officers and Linda didn't want to say anything else. In that case, and do the committee have any questions on this item? Yeah, James.
So I have a very simple one. It mentions civil penalties, but as I recall, this licensing and regulation is meant to be self-financing. We're not meant to make any money out of it. Do the civil penalties, do they come to the council and become part of the overall economics of it? Is that right?
I can answer that one for you. They do come back, but they are a ring fence. We have to, by law, use that money. Any money we receipt for financial penalties has to be used in the enforcement again for private rented sector in the city. It doesn't go into the general fund. It's ring fenced into our work. So that's where that money goes to.
Thanks. I had one question just on page 81 on part of the policy. It seems to imply that someone could be on the rogue landlords database and also be considered a fit and proper person. I just wondered if that was the case, or is the wording there just a bit unclear, perhaps?
It depends on the. It's very unlikely, is that, but it could be a possibility. Could that? Yes, it is very unlikely, but we would probably consider the offences for going onto a rogue landlord database as serious enough to think about the fit and proper person status of that person.
Are there questions from anyone else? Also happy to take recommendations. Nope. Oh, yes, Shasta.
Yeah, so thanks for the work being done on this. So in 2022, the National Rogue Landlords Database had 61 names on it. Point being that the system's been in place for a very, very long time, and the number of landlords being referred to it is obviously minuscule, is a minor word that I'm using here. And given the nature of Oxford and the number of properties that are rented out, if nationally, if this rogue landlord database has not managed to get the numbers it should have, what kind of learning has the City Council done from the national picture? And are we sure that we can actually make sure this system does work in the way that it's supposed to?
The rogue landlord database is, yes, it hasn't been used well, but I think partly that's because of it's quite restrictive as what can go on. I think that with a clearer policy, we can work well to get where it's right that people should be on that rogue landlord database. I think the other thing that is a consideration with the rogue landlord database is it's not a public document. It's just for local authorities as well. But yeah, from a learning point of view, I think this is one of the learning is that we've got a clear policy of where we should be going when we come across, for want of a better term, rogue landlords.
I think Linda wants to come in as well on that.
Yeah, just to add, we have made representations in the past to government about lowering the bar for getting landlords onto the rogue landlords database. And yeah, I just echo what Gail said about that's why it's important that, you know, we have our own stringent, robust policies here about fit and proper people to be landlords, because the government isn't doing its job.
Yeah, Shasta.
Great, thank you very much for that. Also, 2 days ago, it was announced that asylum accommodation is going to be excluded by the government from scrutiny around social housing. So what is the City Council's plans around that? So if the national government is not planning to include that into a crackdown on social housing landlords who are not running property in the way that it should be, it'd be good to know what the City Council's role is in that, given that later we're going to be hearing about the work that's being done around City of Sanctuary. And then the other question I have is later this evening, we're also going to be hearing about domestic abuse. And I'm really pleased that this council is looking at getting accreditation, the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance. So in relation to this rogue landlord work, will it also include social housing landlords who want to rent their property out to asylum seekers, and also will there be some sort of caveat? Is there something we can include specifically to domestic abuse so that our policies are joined up and we're working in a more progressive way than we're seeing in a country which is not very progressive at the moment?
Linda, I don't know if you want to come in or if officers would prefer to.
It might be best for Gail to come in and just about the just provide some clarity about what we're actually able to regulate and what we're not.
Yeah, I mean, if the asylum seekers work, if there are some, how shall I put it? There are some anomalies in some of the guidance that we've had about the housing of asylum seekers, and the fact that we can't apply HMO licensing and selective licensing, property licensing to those properties. If we were receiving complaints about them, we would react to those complaints and do what we could using whatever legislation, and it might not be housing legislation, depending on whether or not what the issue was that we were faced with. So from a reactive service, that's what we would do. From a proactive service, it's because it's not part of the licensing schemes, that's where it becomes difficult to actually go out there and do a proactive programme of such properties. With regards to domestic abuse and social landlords and joined up, I'm more than happy to look at that if the legislation allows us to actually do that, and to take action where we're finding contraventions or breaches of regulation. I don't know whether that's answered your question, but that's where we stand at the moment.
Yeah, can I just add? I mean, as you know, Shyster, like with the situation at the Holiday Inn at the Issam Stadium, I mean, we had no sort of jurisdiction there in terms of like licensing, but this council still took a very active role in terms of making sure that the asylum seekers there, that the accommodation was decent, and that did our best to make sure that their needs were being addressed, with Gail's predecessor chairing a multi-agency meeting to bring people together to try and make sure that was happening, and visits there including yourself. So yeah, just to reiterate that just because we don't have the legal powers, if we think that something is wrong, then we will find a way to get involved and put it right.
Thanks, Linda. I wonder if maybe there could be a recommendation around that, like something around asking for clarity on how the sort of principles of this policy apply to social housing providers. Yeah. And also to asylum housing too.
Accreditation as well. How was that?
Yeah, we could ask for some clarity on that bit too. Okay. Are there other questions from anyone? No. Are there any other recommendations? Nope. So, Alice, do you need more clarity on wording for those ones, or
I think
you can pull something together? Excellent. Okay. If there's no other recommendations, then I think that's 2, maybe 3, depending on how they're worded for this item. Thank you, Linda, Gail, and David for coming and talking to us about that. Really appreciated. Thanks. The next item is the DAHA Accreditation and Domestic Abuse Review Group update, which was a paper requested by Scrutiny. We've got Mark Ligo, Richard Adams and Liz Jones to introduce the report. Thanks. Yeah, do go ahead when you're ready.
Would you like me to introduce the report, Richard? Mark? With Mark?
I'll just say a couple of words and then we'll just go through the recommendations, if that's okay. So this report has already been to scrutiny. It's come back for the 48 recommendations. So to note and comment on the report and agree any recommendations in relation to the DAHA accreditation element of the report. Cabinet agreed with the majority of the 48 domestic abuse review group recommendations, which were endorsed by the Scrutiny Committee on the 2nd of March 2021, and Scrutiny has requested an update on the progress made against these recommendations since a previous update on the 5th of April 2022, which is attached on Appendix 1. The committee also requested an update on the progress towards the DAHA accreditation. So we've got 48 recommendations here. Before we go into that, what I would like to do, and I should have said this first, I just want for the committee to know, to thank former Cabinet member Shyster for her time and effort and enthusiasm taking this forward as well, and it was honoured to take over. So thank you, Shyster. So we've got 48 recommendations, and most of them that we have agreed on, and it's up to the committee and officers if they're in agreement, is probably to have a look at those that are in part and why they're in part, and those not agreed, if that's okay with the committee, because we're just coming here to looking at the 48 recommendations, because most of the things that we are actually doing or doing in part or in progress anyway. I'm just going to hand over to Liz, and if we just concentrate on the ones that not necessarily we're already in agreement with, but those in part, if that's okay, Liz.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Okay, so we're in part agreement, I think, is recommendation 12, that the allocation scheme changes references from domestic violence to domestic abuse. This is changing the allocations policy is actually quite complicated. They have been using the term domestic abuse, and when it's up for review, they will be changed. Unfortunately, I haven't got the date when it will be, but I have been talking to our housing partners around all our policies on domestic abuse, and on all policies to include domestic abuse and make sure they're fit for purpose when it comes to the DAHA accreditation. Other ones in part agreed was 20, the provision for the sanctuary scheme. The Domestic Abuse Act of 2021 made it a statutory duty for all local authorities to provide safe accommodation. As we're a district authority, we provide the sanctuary scheme, and this is funded year on year and has been for many years, and will continue to fund certainly for the foreseeable future. But as we're all aware, there are huge budget pressures and potentially a change in government later this year. So it's a bit unsure about what will be happening around that. But there is no desire to remove the sanctuary scheme, especially now it's a statutory provision that we must provide. The other in part that hasn't been completed as yet, and again, we're coming up for a grant funding review, and we at the moment we co-commission our domestic abuse services in Oxfordshire, and we contribute to that co-commissioning through our grant funding process, and this has been ring-fenced for 3 years. It will end in 2025, and obviously, again, with some cuts that are necessary within the council, I'm speaking to my colleagues in the communities about the grant funding moving forward. The recommendation 32, the council continues to support grant funding for by and for organisations. That has been complete, but again, as we're saying, we've done a lot of work of by and for with our specialist services, and putting in a lot more focus on having by and for specific staff, which both of our services do have, and do pay a lot of attention to improve their response to people from minoritized communities and from LGBT communities as well, and disabled communities. Funding is always going to be a problem to pay for staff that are specifically buying for, as funding is not, there's not enough funding for the demand mostly. So, but we certainly have for minoritized communities improved our response with our specialist domestic abuse services. The recommendation 34, that will be considered with the DAHA accreditation. This is around domestic abuse prevention and support, and we are continuing to do that within the council. The 36 is the council extends its definition of social value to procurement to opportunities. Now, put in part, I did speak to our procurement team, and again, everything is a little bit more complicated, and this would mean changing a number of documents. Again, it's waiting for review. I have to confess, I have not contacted them recently, but we'll put that on an action plan to contact them to see that this has been completed. 41, the council is a shareholder of wholly owned companies, implements domestic abuse policies in these companies. We are talking to especially our Oxford Direct Services around domestic abuse, and looking at auditing their processes and seeing where we can improve them as well, so that they have a better response to domestic abuse. But I do know that there's a real push and willingness to improve their safeguarding generally, and domestic abuse specifically within ODS. And the final one that's in part is 44. The council reviews, there is another one. The adequacy of internal training. This is actually quite difficult. We do have a significant amount of training available to all staff that's free through the Safeguarding Board, and there are regular reminders to staff to attend these courses. They are all online, and they're all part half a day training, but they can build on each of that. There's about 7 different courses that they can do and build on their knowledge. We have been delivering internal training, and we've just about to release a training plan for 2024 internally, which will include managers briefing, which we're hoping that all managers will attend. So over the next year, we'll see a significant amount of training internally, but there is external training as well that staff can attend. Where there's webinars, we do inform frontline staff, webinars on specialist subjects around domestic abuse, that they can attend those, especially if they're free. So that is ongoing work. 45, making management training mandatory. We are asking managers to come, and we're hoping that they will attend. Making a mandatory training is not always easy, because we have to then police it and make sure that people have attended, and HR struggle with capacity to be able to do that. But we will be pushing out quite hard on this for managers, as it's only a briefing rather than a full training session, so that they'll be able to support their staff, either who may be experiencing domestic abuse themselves, or support their staff who are working frontline with domestic abuse survivors.
Thanks, Liz. Was that everything you needed to present, or was there anything else? Yeah, Mark.
Just quickly, and those that not agreed, and some of those, I think there's about 8 or 9. Generally, we're already doing this, or there's a pathway doing this anyway. So I think it might be best to open up to the scrutiny if they want to ask any more questions. Like I say, it's already been here. These are just to agree the recommendations and going forward. But I'll leave it in your hands, Chair.
Thanks, Mark. There's a quick update from Alice on one of the recommendations.
Yeah, so it's just in relation to recommendation 40, which is about the practicability of including an explicit expectation that councillors will not perpetrate domestic abuse in the Constitution. I've spoken to the head of law and governance, and she's advised that actually that's not something that can be included in the Constitution because there's no ability or power for the council to state that councillors can't act that way in their personal capacity, if that makes sense. The council can only speak about the capacity of a councillor rather than in their personal lives. So that's just an update on that one, that it has been considered, but it's not deemed practical for that document.
Thanks. Are there any questions from the committee? Yeah, Maha.
Recommendation 20, it says the Domestic Abuse Act makes statutory duty to provide safe accommodation. And in the previous report, also the cabinet members said some of the accommodation which is provided, such as budget hotels and holiday inns, where there are people put in, whether they were due to domestic abuse and as a homelessness, and they are there, and you don't have much control over it. But the Act says that you provide safe accommodation. And what I'm hearing that some of these accommodations, so I have talked with somebody as actually the victim, who tells me that the accommodations are not fit and proper, and they have been going backward forward with the council officer for months and still not been moved from there. So where do we stand if we say Act says provide safe accommodation? We don't have control over those hotels, and the people who live there seems or says that this is not safe, or this is not the accommodation they would have expected.
Yeah, thanks.
Would you like me to answer that?
I think Mark's going to come in on that.
No, that's fine. Liz, accommodation
okay,
wants, that's fine. Yeah.
Liz, go ahead.
Okay, the safe accommodation, I do take your point, is actually refuge provision, which we do have in Oxfordshire. We have sanctuary scheme is safe accommodation, and places of safety, which we have. It doesn't actually include temporary accommodation. As you're aware, we are in housing is incredibly difficult in our area, and getting accommodation. I do think it's a shame if anybody has to go into a hotel, but I'm aware that sometimes there is no other choice to put people in hotels. We are trying desperately to ensure that when they are in hotels, they are given enough support and they are moved out of hotels as quickly as possible into either our temporary accommodation that we have, or into a place of safety, or to house them with our registered providers. But I do agree, hotels are not suitable for families to stay in for any length of time. What we're working towards is giving people choices. Now, we can offer people refuge provision, but I have to say refuge provision is also quite difficult to live in. You lose all your property, you lose all your possessions, except for what you can basically carry. Where that is what the victim needs, and of course we should facilitate that. But often people want to remain locally because they have a support network. So we have to work with that as well, and provide them with what is available. I agree that hotels are not appropriate, but it's a really difficult situation that we're in.
I think Altaf wanted to come back.
Yeah, I want to come back. Sorry to say this, but the bottom point is we are failing to the individuals, human beings. I'm not very much a bureaucratic language about the sanctuary scheme or the other scheme, but there are individuals who've been put into hotels and we don't have much control over it. And the Act says simply, it doesn't say about the sanctuary scheme or the asylum or anything. It says here, and it's clear, to make statutory duty to provide safe accommodation. So how come is this we are accepting that this is not ideal situation, but we also know that they are not safe. So how do we justify ourselves to ordinary people in street?
Mark, did you want to come back on
Just
that?
quickly, to be honest, I don't like the tone, sort of language on failing, to be honest. When we've got officers in the city council and our partners and deciding welcoming, safe and restored and everything, doing what we can, you know, one domestic abuse case is one too many, and we are working extremely hard. They are working extremely hard. So failings, I'd like that to be corrected, because it's not a failing at all. And what a lot of this comes down to is like government funding as well. And I don't want to get too political on this, but I'll let Liz come in just to answer your question.
Liz, go ahead.
I like I said, I do agree. It is difficult. How do you keep somebody safe? But sometimes for people, I mean, they're not forced to go into a hotel. Unfortunately, they're fleeing domestic abuse. I think really, my housing partners would be better placed to really answer why we're putting people in hotels, because I personally also agree that we shouldn't be, but I do understand the pressures that are under our housing departments are under. And as I said, we do try very hard not to do that. And if we do have to, we have to move them. We move them as quickly as we possibly can.
I think Linda, who wasn't speaking on this item, but is still here and has put her hand up. So please do answer it if you want to.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, with your permission, like I said, I'm not here for this item, but maybe it'd just be helpful to point out to Councillor Khan that the housing needs team is facing unprecedented demand. We've got twice as many people presenting to the council as homeless as we were having 2 years ago. We've got twice as many people in temporary accommodation as we did 2 years ago. Ordinarily, this council has access to just over about 100 units of temporary accommodation. But because of the unprecedented demand and the rapid rise in demand of households facing homelessness, we've now got, as I said, we've got twice that number needing temporary accommodation. So we just can't find anything other than hotels for them, and that unfortunately is meaning that we are having to put people in hotels, in Oxford and further afield, and we know that's not good for families, and it's not good for this council either, because we are overspending. It's costly to this council to do that. So I will be bringing forward some options to address that and increase our supply of temporary accommodation. Because unfortunately that's needed with the homelessness crisis that we're facing. But it's not something that can be done overnight, but it is something where work is being done.
Thanks. I think we've got Lubna and then Shyster. Perhaps if you both do your questions at once and we can answer them together.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, my question is to Liz, really. It's just following on from Altaf's question, actually, with regards to scenarios where people are in temporary hotel accommodation with no cooking facilities, with children, sometimes gets very difficult. And, you know, the services you said in the report, which I read quite carefully now, it says that, you know, there's going to be support link workers and there are going to be people who are going to handhold you through that very traumatizing process. And my question, Chair, is the fact that if there is a scenario where you're in a hotel for 4 months with nothing and you're supposed to be handholding, and I'm getting the calls, literally people crying down the phone and saying, you know, we need to be moved on. Is there a possibility, although we've got a housing crisis and temporary accommodation, you know, for victims of domestic abuse, you know, because although work is being done and that's not being dismissed, is there any options where more one-to-one service can be given to keep the people who are in that scenario? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And we have Shaista's question.
Yes, so my question. Thank you. So my question is about point number 44, about the DA training. I just wanted to know, for council staff, does DA training come under safeguarding or not? Where is it placed in the training?
Thanks. Oh yeah, Liz, please could you go ahead and answer? Sorry.
So safeguarding training, we deliver internally a safeguarding briefing, which is mandatory for all staff, and domestic abuse is included in that. Also, there's everybody's informed of who are the domestic abuse champions. We've got 23 domestic abuse champions within the City Council who they can talk to and get advice and support if they've got a case or they themselves are experiencing domestic abuse. Within the safeguarding boards training, there's also domestic abuse is also included in that. So there is some, it isn't comprehensive, but it is mentioned, and that's why the safeguarding boards also have further domestic abuse training in the on their boards, which is free, and why we're doing some internal free training as well.
I don't know, Mark, maybe you have the answer to Lubna's question, or
I'm led to believe that there is help and support there through the voluntary sector. Some of those questions, when you're saying that one-to-one training or one-to-one support.
Sorry. Just to improve the pathways. So when it says the response for victim survivors, building strong links, sometimes when they're in a hotel and they've been moved there to get them away, but once they're there, they're just sort of left and there's not continuous. So either that's a communication breakdown or there's not enough strengthening those links with the people on the ground to be moving on.
I didn't believe that was happening. If it is, I'm going to be case by case, and I think it's one of those that any case that comes through, to send it up to myself or to Liz, and we'll deal with this, whether it's through children and young people, through adult social care. Let us know, because I'm led to believe that all the support is there for those in hotels.
are there any other questions? I had one just on funding. Is there, because obviously a lot of the stuff talked about in this report was funded through specific funding from DLUC or specific grant funding. Is there a risk that when that funding from DLUC runs out in March 2025, that the DAHA accreditation could be at risk? And has that been thought about what the options will be after March 2025? Yeah, Mark.
I'm going to pass this one over to Liz.
Thank you, Mark. There is always a risk. You're absolutely right. It won't affect the DAHA accreditation because we're hopeful that by that time we will have achieved accreditation by end of March 2025. But it will, to maintain that accreditation, we will have to pay a certain amount. I think it's about 2,500 to 3,000 a year towards keeping that accreditation. So that would be the cost. The cost at the moment that we're getting the funding is to pay for the DAHA project manager, and she works part-time, 3.5 days a week. And the funding that DLUC have given us pays for that post, but that will run out in potentially runs out in 2025.
Thanks. If there aren't any more questions, we could move to recommendations. I was going to suggest, perhaps based on Lubna's question, we could ask Cabinet whether it was they felt whether they could assess whether there was clear enough support and signposting to support given to people in temporary accommodation, and if Cabinet wants to tell us that there is plenty there, then that can happen. Would people be happy with that as a recommendation? Yeah. Is that enough detail? Has anyone else got any recommendations? Yeah, Imogen.
Thanks, Councillor Ligo, for helpful responses to questions. You did mention kind of government failings playing a role in this, and I was wondering if there's a recommendation around taking any opportunities to lobby based on the horrific lived experience we're hearing from people in Oxford to really put pressure on the government to sort that out when they're giving us legal duties to deal with things and not the resources to go with it.
Yeah, we could recommend that Mark or Susan, somebody, right, yeah, okay. Yeah, is that enough on that one as well? Excellent. Anything else, Shasta?
Yeah, just to continue from that excellent point there, I think we also need to really focus on children because as we know, the domestic abuse legislation also covers the lived experience of children. I've raised this in that housing panel as well. So I think it's just really important that we ensure that alongside adult victims of domestic abuse, that we also include children in children's experiences, but also remember that we cover them in all aspects of our work on this specific issue as well. And before I just go away, just want to say thank you very much to Liz Jones and the team for all the work you do day in, day out, and also Councillor Ligo and everybody involved in this work. Thank you.
Is that, just to clarify on the recommendation, to recommend, is it on the previous recommendation that there's specific support, to ask if there's specific support for children, or do you want to ask a separate recommendation to ask Cabinet to have more explicit policies on supporting children as part of this?
I think what I would like is when we are looking at data that we're collecting on the issue of domestic abuse in the city, that we also include children in that as well. So I've asked separately questions, the housing panel, about how many children are in temporary accommodation alongside adults because of domestic abuse. So
does that I think that makes sense as a recommendation. Is that good? Yeah. Okay. Lubna, did you have one as well?
Yeah, it was just around the timetable of the training being given to one of the recommendation number 8 for councillors. How often would that be? Is that every year, or, because I think it's important to be champions for domestic abuse, and it's something I would be very much interested in doing. And I know that other organizations, charities, they do arrange stuff like that, but is that something we should be leading on? Yeah.
Mark?
If you want that as a recommendation, that's fine. And I think what we should be having as councillors is a yearly training as well. And like I said, I think we've got 23 or 24 champions within the City Council already. That's fine with me.
Perhaps we could recommend that there's annual training for councillors and that a action on domestic abuse or something champion is appointed. Yeah. Are there any objections to any of those recommendations that we've suggested? No, Mark.
I don't want to put Richard or Liz in too much trouble, but I'm hoping actually from this, not on a recommendation, that later on in the year to have a briefing for all councillors. So I think it'd be very useful to discuss about domestic abuse, and also getting organisations like Response and Safe to explain about what they do. So a bit of a Q&A briefing will help. But this is not a recommendation, just an update that I'm looking to have later on in the year.
Thanks. If there's no other recommendations that people wanted to put forward, I think that is everything on that item. Thank you, Mark, Richard and Liz, for coming and talk to us. Thanks. The next item that we have is the draft corporate strategy for 2024 to 28 for consultation. We've got Susan Brown, Caroline Green, Lucy Cherry and Claire Keane, at least some of whom are here in person. So whenever you're ready, please do introduce the report.
Thanks very much, Lucy, and apologies for, I had intended to be there in person, but in fact, yes, things conspired against me and I'm now joining online. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today about the draft corporate strategy. I think we've hopefully had a few discussions around this over the years. This is, however, the start of a new strategy. And what the report sets out is the processes we've gone through in order to talk to people about what should go into it, to try and seek as wide a view as possible from all sorts of different groups within the city, sort of key stakeholders, and of course councillors. So that is summarised in one of the appendices of the report. And this is the beginning of the sort of bare bones of the corporate strategy, obviously very far from being designed and all the rest of it at this stage, but the sort of ideas that we want to go out to people to say, is this right? Is this where you think we should be heading? Should these be our core priorities for the next 4 years? And I think it will come as no surprise to people that the areas of focus are very much as they have been previously around good affordable homes, a strong fair economy, thriving communities, climate action, and importantly and underlying one which perhaps we hadn't been quite so specific about in previous years but is very much part of our thinking, the efficiency and stability that underlies everything that we do and enables us to do those other 4 key priorities. So unless we are an efficient and effective and financially stable council, we cannot do all of those other things. And I think we've seen in the news this week, and unfortunately over many weeks and months recently, what happens when councils don't have strong and stable finances, and the cuts that many councils are having to make, which largely speaking we have been somewhat protected from, not entirely, and we all know that this budget process this year is more difficult than it has been for many years, but nonetheless, we are not in a position, I'm very glad to say, where we are having to seriously think about closing all our leisure centres, as some councils are indeed doing. So that's a little bit about the sort of broad brush approach. I think what we've also tried to do, and this is bearing in mind the feedback we've got from, well, actually from all of us as councillors. I think we've been through various different performance reports over the last 4 years and gone, we've really had too many priorities and they're not really measurable in terms of what the city council is doing to help achieve them. So what we're trying to do is get a little bit more focused in terms of our commitments and priorities, and those are also set out in the report, although the actual measurables and indicators are not sort of here yet, because obviously that kind of comes a bit later. So I don't really think there's an awful lot more that I want to say at this moment. I'm really happy to take questions, but officers probably have got more that they can add, particularly about the processes of who we've been talking to. There is a list, as I said, in Appendix 2, which kind of gives you quite a good view, I think, of all the different people and bodies that have fed into the process so far. And for instance, gosh, when was it? Last week, I think it was, I was meeting with the parish councils, some of them at any rate, not all of them were able to attend, and getting their views to be fed into the process. But yeah, as I said, happy to hand over to officers to add to what I have said.
Thanks. Yeah, Caroline, Lucy, Claire, if there's anything you want to add now, please do.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just to add to Councillor Brown's comments on who we've engaged with already, we've also taken the opportunity to join up and link in with our partnerships such as the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, the Oxford Economic Growth Board, Children and Young People's Partnership, and Appendix 2 gives an indication of just one stakeholder session and how we have reached out to quite a wide range of people at this first stage to live our principles of the thriving community strategy of doing with and not to. So we really worked hard at doing that, and linked in also the Oxford Strategic Partnership back in April 2023, and again more recently in the last meeting just before Christmas. So it's been a constant process of checking, challenging, and importantly we've also engaged internally with our staff and each other as well as all the members as much as possible.
Thanks. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the point that Councillor Brown made about the KPIs for this. Obviously, we had to get to a point where we'd done enough work around the what the priorities are and what that sort of looks like before we look at the KPIs. So we have started. We've got the sort of first draft of those, and that's at the moment being worked through again with sort of working, reaching out across the council and partners to make sure that we've got those right, and they will be. They will all come together in the final document, but it is necessarily something that is following on.
That's great. Are there any questions from committee at all? Yeah, Chris.
I'm trying to think of the least politically contentious way to phrase this one. I think I might have hit on a formulation. So one thing we mention, which we don't mention as a goal when it comes to housing, we mention various different ways that we want to try to improve people's cost of living by delivering new affordable units, by lobbying for rent controls and so on. But the first and most obvious way that we can improve people's cost of living is by influencing the price of housing and rents on the open market. Now, that's obviously something where we have much more limited influence than those other ways that people pay for their housing. But we do have influence in that the housing targets we set in the local plan and the site allocations that we make in the local plan will influence that, because they are the council sort of pressing on the supply and demand equation in terms of how much housing there is locally relative to how much demand there is locally for housing. So I suppose the question and perhaps the recommendation is, should it be an explicit goal that we do influence, to whatever extent we are able, the open market price of housing?
Do you want me to answer that, Lucy?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'll try. Well, I mean, I'm not sure that any levers that we have is really going to influence the price of open market housing in Oxford, because we just don't have the ability to either build ourselves that much housing or influence others to build that much housing, because there are relatively few housing sites left in Oxford. I mean, all the largest sites have really been put on already, so it's or are already being built on and allocated as part of the local plan. So I really struggle to see what on earth we could do that would make that a pledge that was worth having, because I just don't see how realistically we could be doing so.
Thanks. Has anyone else got questions on this? I was just going to ask, I think when you've spoken to councillors about this, and also when you're talking about it now, you talked about prioritisation a lot and trying to kind of slim down the number of things which the council is focusing on. I just wondered if there are any key areas that you would say have sort of been deprioritised as part of that. It'd probably be useful to know.
That's a good question. I think I'm not sure that I'd say that any area has been deprioritised. I think it's more that we haven't tried to have quite so many so many priorities in each area. So, we are trying to sort of get back to what are the core things that will actually help us achieve our aims in each of our priority areas, rather than delving down into a huge amount of detail. I mean, which is to say that actually quite a lot of the work that we had put in previous versions will continue to carry on. But it's not being sort of set up as a big priority. It's not something that's being monitored in quite the same level, because we do want to sort of try and make sure that people are more focused. I mean, having said all of that, we are going to have to find some different ways of working as we go forward, because that is one of the aims of the council in terms of efficiency and stability. But I don't think that we have identified whole areas where we're sort of stepping out at the moment.
I suppose if there were any examples of like smaller things, even if it's not like big areas of work or just like smaller things which have been slightly put on the back burner or like the work and the amount of time put into them decreased, maybe it would be useful to flag if anything comes to mind.
Caroline, have you got anything you think you might want to offer up at this particular point? Because I'm not off the top of my head, I can't think of anything.
Thank you, Susan. Sorry, I was trying to find my hand, so thank you very much for flagging that. I mean, I think one area where you could point to a change is just in the transport space this time, where rather than saying it is, not something that we are interested in, we are recognising that actually that is one that we need to work to influence and partner, rather than being able to dedicate a huge amount of officer time. And that's sort of reflected in some of the proposals that you'll see coming through the budget process as well. So I think there has been a process of things like that, identifying where, actually, are we getting the right level of outcome for the input of the resources, and where would we be actually better focusing emphasis on partnership rather than what we do ourselves. I'm sure it would actually be quite a good and useful exercise for us to do that piece of analysis and comparison between the last iteration and this, so that we can be we can come up with some other examples, because what I do know is that Lucy and Claire have done an amazing job actually of working through a whole list of proposals and suggestions and thoughts that they've had into this process. And certainly I think this is an improvement on our previous version in terms of the clarity that it brings. But I think that analysis about what's actually changed between this and the last version would be quite a useful thing for us to do.
Susan?
Thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to add that. I mean, I think it's partly because of the way in which we've done this, because in previous years we've just sort of had kind of iterations of the existing strategy, obviously, but I mean we have sort of started again at this time, so we've deliberately not been kind of looking back and kind of going, oh, should we put this in or should we put that in? It was, we haven't been transferring stuff over from the previous strategy. We've started again. And actually, funnily enough, a lot of the things that were in the previous strategy are still really core commitments and priorities. But we, as I said, haven't delved down into quite such a lot of detail.
Thanks. Claire and Lucy, earlier you I don't know if you wanted to come in. You don't need to, but if you want to, please do.
I think actually Caroline covered it. We were just conferring about the transport issue being one where we've changed the emphasis.
Great. Any other questions? Chris?
Thanks. I would like to gently push back on the sort of slight counsel of despair we had earlier about our ability to be influential in the private market, just on grounds that I think a reasonable argument could be made that what's changed in the past 5, well, probably more like 8 or 9 years, in terms of the fact that we're quite likely to have significant new housing projects on the immediate fringe of Oxford that probably would have been unthinkable 10, 15 years ago. They seem to me to be of a scale that is probably influential in a macroeconomic sense. Obviously, we can't know what the alternate universe looks like, but they seem to me as probably influential. And obviously, the way that they got there was by cross-district cooperation on that occasion. And probably, if anything similar were to happen in the future, it would also be by negotiation and cooperation with our neighbours. I don't deny that it's something that would be much more difficult for us to deliver ourselves. But I suppose my argument would be that were it not for Oxford participating in that process, that probably wouldn't have happened, and that does constitute sort of significant macroeconomic influence. and therefore, even if it's something that it's difficult to do and it requires many partners to work together, I don't think we ought to despair of potentially being able to cooperate more in the future.
Who'd like to respond to that one?
I'm happy to respond. Well, I'm very grateful to Chris for his kind words about our partnership working with neighbouring authorities over building housing. And he's absolutely right. I think that's a very important, certainly very important part of how we deliver housing and so on. I would say that I think that most of the relevant sites have now been allocated. So if we're looking forward, and this plan is about looking forward for the next 4 years, I think that we may or may not see some of those sites being built out. We have no influence over that now because they are not in our local authority. So I still think my point stands, but I think that he is right to say that partnership working when it comes to delivering housing is really important. We absolutely want to be cooperating with neighbouring local authorities. It's really important because we desperately need housing in Oxford, and in particular, we desperately need affordable housing in Oxford. I certainly share his aspirations for making housing more affordable to buy for people as well. I think that is one of the reasons why we operate shared ownership schemes, because that tends to be the only way that we find that does enable ordinary people to buy housing in Oxford.
Thanks. Any questions or recommendations? Got Shyster and then Imogen.
Yeah, so just some comments really. First of all, thanks for all the work that's gone into this. I'm really keen to understand though how these top line sort of focus points, how are they interconnected with each other? So for example, thriving communities and climate action, what kind of work is being done in communities, alongside communities around climate action, and also this story about Oxford, ordinary people getting access to housing in Oxford. I don't know any ordinary people who can afford to buy anything in Oxford, let alone a house, and that story is not going to change unless we have a bolder vision. And I do think that given that the expectations are that there's going to be a new government, I think that we should be having a more a more ambitious vision for affordable housing in our city that is truly affordable. I absolutely accept that this council is not responsible for that, and but I do think we need to be lobbying around that. So I'd like to see the area of focus around good affordable homes. We will improve existing housing. I think we need to go deeper than that, and I'd like to see that in there. But my main point is around how this corporate strategy, these headlines, how are you going to sort of bring them together in terms of, is it just looking at climate action and the economy separately, or is it looking at it together? So I'd like to see a more joined up way of working on those issues.
And maybe we'll take Imogen's question straight away and answer them together.
Okay, it is a little bit complicated. One quick challenge that I did make in the review, the feedback process as well, on the first page in the kind of areas of focus bullet point list, which is really, really top level for an already top level document, it specifies under climate action, facilitating more electric vehicle infrastructure. And I think really the top level things should be doing whatever is best to reduce transport emissions. And there's plenty to suggest that prioritising electric vehicles might not be the answer in terms of we're trying to move away from cars. And this is something that some would argue prolongs their life, that sort of thing. It also is problematic in terms of half of the emissions related to electric vehicles being out of scope, being in production, which we don't actually measure as a council. So I have my own personal problems with that, but I think most people would agree that as a top level demand, that's a bit out of place. I also note that this committee has already made a recommendation in the previous meeting around engagement with local anchor institutions, as was mentioned, being at the heart of the corporate strategy. And I was really happy to see in the strong and fair economy section, some thoughts around community wealth building in terms of local jobs, access to skills and reskilling training for people within Oxford. So I think that was some of the thinking that informed that recommendation to be engaging with anchor institutions. I would have really liked to see an explicit reference to community wealth building in the document. And I mean, I would like to see that throughout, but in the strong, fair economy section would make particular sense. So I think I'd like to see that as a recommendation. And also, I think that engagement with anchor institutions could come into the Zero Carbon Oxford section more explicitly, and particularly, and this is something I've said in this committee before and I will keep saying, I think we really need honesty and transparency around out of scope emissions. And these anchor institutions and ZCOP, as we've talked about, are really good ways of joining the dots. And where something becomes out of scope for us, it actually might be in scope for someone else. The example I always use is when the university is able to report that it's made a cut in emissions because everybody's now working from home. So all of their office emissions, 20 people in one office are now 20 people in 20 different homes that are being heated. So a problem for the university is solved, but that problem becomes our problem because we have to deal with potentially some of those, addressing some of the problems around retrofit. So I think thinking about where decisions are from institutions are impacting one another and potentially thinking about liability there. If the Oxford University is making a saving on office costs, could some of that go into budgets around the extra pressure on us? I think starting those conversations honestly is really important. I'd really like to see that in a top level document. Thanks.
I think that is a specific questions on interconnection between the different priorities about harnessing the power of anchor institutions, and then sort of comments made about the EV being included as a top level ask and having a bolder vision on housing affordability. Caroline, I think you've got a hand up to respond. Maybe not.
I think Caroline's saying after me.
Okay,
Exactly what I'm saying. I put my hand up after Susan indicated.
So, sorry. Thank you very much for some very good questions. First of all, on the interaction between thriving communities and climate action, and indeed the interaction between all of these different priorities and areas of focus, I think that's a really important point, and I think there are a number of different actions which sit under one of those columns, which could almost sit under several, but actually we're obviously not going to put the same action in under lots of different columns because that would be quite tedious and repetitive. But it is important to recognise that we want all of these areas to be doing all of these things. So, it's important that people have good, affordable homes because that actually does support our strong, fair economy. We need to make sure that those homes are either retrofitted or being built to the right standards to tackle our climate change goals. And having a decent home is important for people's health and their ability to enjoy our city. So, all of these things do interconnect. Very specifically on what are we doing in terms of sort of climate action that does support thriving communities. And I actually think there's really good examples in your own Wilchester, in Rose Hill, because there's a lot of work that's being done there very specifically, that is in an area of relative deprivation. It's really important that we do. I think it's very important that we make sure that we are helping people who most need our help first, and that's where we should be doing the work. On Imogen's point around why have we got in a high level area of focus an issue which says facilitating more electric vehicle infrastructure. If we were the Transport Authority, I would agree with you. I don't think it should sit there, but the truth is we're not, and therefore actually we can facilitate more electric vehicle infrastructure because that's one of the things we can do as a city council. But some of the bigger areas around transport policy we have less influence over, and that's why I would say that is in there. But I do kind of agree with you that it does read slightly oddly, so maybe we do need to think about how that could be reworded. Just trying to think what else you were raising, some really valid points around the Zero Carbon Oxford section and anchor institutions. I do think we will want to have something in here, and you know, as you quite rightly said, we've sort of fed in at different points. The work that we are doing with other anchor institutions, particularly around ZCOP, but not just around ZCOP, also around health inequalities, around tackling poverty, that is absolutely vital to our work. We will not achieve our goals as a city council and for our city unless we work in partnership. I mean, partly going back to the points I was making earlier to Chris, because I think that is exactly right. And in terms of, but then in terms of sort of how we measure some of those things, I feel that is getting into quite a lot of detail that probably does sit better in sort of discussions that we might be having in ZCOP. And I think we are trying to look at how we share resources, and there is quite a lot of resource sharing going on at the moment between both universities, the city council, the county council. I mean, I think we are all trying to work together much more closely in the public interest, in the public good, to try and share learning and also to create learning for other institutions, for other businesses, for small businesses, so that they will have pathways that they can follow. And that is a whole part of the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, to be that kind of pathfinder, and give people examples of how things could work for them. I will now pass over to Caroline.
Caroline, do you?
I won't repeat anything that Susan said. Just one point I thought would be useful to add, because the point that Councillor Aziz raised about interconnectivity and interaction between different priorities and different actions is one that's been raised actually in our conversations with staff around the strategy as well. So, you know, Susan said we do recognise that challenge, and there is just sort of just been lots of discussion about what fits best where and how do we avoid duplication. But one thing I think it was worth flagging is that when we have consulted on the document and when it eventually gets published, it is accompanied by a forward, and I think that is the place in which we can draw out some of these points that I think are being rightly raised about how do we help people understand some of these overarching messages that we want to put across. And I would say the similar approach to what we mean by and how we highlight the importance of work with anchor institutions could be something that we include there. So I think that's really useful. And then just on the point about Councillor Thomas's point about not seeing community wealth being in wealth building in there, we have tried really hard to make sure that the document is jargon free, which is quite a challenge for us as officers sometimes. But so I think there was a debate about, you know, these terms and a decision that we should try and avoid using them. We were trying to capture some of the principles of community wellbeing, returning wealth and benefits of economic activity back to local communities within the document. But you know, obviously we'll be looking for comments and ways in which we can improve that.
I think Claire had her hand up, and then Susan, we'll go back to you again.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on Councillor Thomas's point about the high-level point at the introduction. And as the person who has been holding the pen on this, I am going to confess that that's a drafting error, that I've updated the zero carbon section, but not gone back to the forward. And it should say that it's developing low carbon infrastructure and support households, businesses and institutions to save energy and cut emissions, which then covers a much wider range of things. And so I will make sure that that is corrected. So yes, I just wanted to say thank you for raising that, and I have spotted that error.
Thanks. Susan.
Well, that's good. I think that solves that one. And I agree, that sounds like a better form of wording. So very happy with that. I just wanted to pick up on the point that Caroline was making about jargon and to warn that I actually personally have an aversion to the expression anchor institutions as well. We know what we're talking about when we say anchor institutions. I don't think the vast majority of people out there do. So just to warn you that although we will talk about it, we may not use the words because I just don't think it's helpful. It's helpful if we want to tick boxes and make sure that people know that we do this, but actually the people who need to know that we're doing work as anchor institutions do know that, because we are doing it. We are working together as anchor institutions. But I think we need to find a better way of expressing it, because I just don't think it's very meaningful for most people.
I'm going to suggest we move on to recommendations now. Does anyone have one? I feel like a few things have come up. One I was going to say to kick off with was, I feel like Caroline, you sort of mildly suggested one about recommending that a comparison is done between the strategy being consulted on and the current corporate strategy in light of the prioritisation, and sort of showing the differences really clearly. So we'd be happy to have that as a recommendation. Yeah. And then Shyster and Imogen, I feel like you saw, I don't know if you had one. Maybe not. No. Okay, Imogen's got one.
I kind of take the point. I'm really glad it's accessible and readable. There is a balance, I think, always with jargon, because we want to be accountable, and we also want these documents. If somebody was searching Oxford City Council community wealth building, we would want this document to come up, because it is about it in lots of ways. If we're talking about working, local economy, apprenticeships, things like that. So I suppose I'm a bit torn on that. I do think we could, at the very, very least, in the strong fair economy section, include the words shorten supply chains. So that's something that's missing. That's another community wealth building principle. But I think the appeal of using the words community wealth building somewhere in that is that this is very high level, and that encapsulates a lot of different things that we then don't have to spell out. So I would still quite like to see those words in it. In terms of not using the phrase anchor institutions, but adding something, in the zero carbon Oxford section, I would like to see wording along these lines, working in partnership with other institutions in Oxford, anchor institutions, to ensure a joined up approach to tackling emissions, which I don't think, I would challenge Susan's response on that. I don't think that's getting too much into the detail. I think it's very, very similar to the point under priorities in thriving communities to work in partnership with communities, organisations and agencies to reduce inequalities. I would like to see something similar in the zero carbon Oxford section. So those two for me, I hope they make sense.
Yeah, so that sounds like something to say in the zero carbon Oxford bit, say something explicitly about working with other institutions in the city, and then to say something about community wealth building, but not explicitly using that language, perhaps. Lizzie, have you got an objection or support for that?
Yeah, I guess I'm fine with suggesting the first one. That sounds really sensible to me. I think we've agreed that the principles of it are already, or the principles we want are already in there, at which point I really don't want us to end up going down the jargony path. I think it's really important that this is a document that's accessible for the people that the council's trying to serve. And I do think that we risk kind of getting stuck in trying to make it, I'm not really sure I'm less bothered about someone Googling it and seeing community wealth building. I'm more interested in someone reading it and understanding what it's actually aiming to set out to do, which I think they're going to get more from the document in its current wording. So I would be less happy about that one, but it's a recommendation, so I'm not going to sort of start a huge fight about it.
Again, I'm not married to it, but a counter argument to that would be that it is important for us to be specific enough to be committed to meaningful action. if it's too user friendly, then are we saying anything that we can be held accountable for? So I'd like to see maybe the wording shorten supply chains, maybe the phrase community wealth building. I'm open to suggestions, but something that I would think like, okay, we've committed to this and we can be held to account for it. That's what I'm missing from the community wealth building principles I'd like to see in there.
I'm not sure if Claire was going to have a clever suggestion around this, or
we were just having a mutter. In the Thriving Community Strategy, we had a page that said terms we've used in this document, and perhaps that's one of perhaps that could be the recommendation, is to have terms that we've used as a section to demystify some of these things.
Yeah, that sounds like even outside of this discussion, that sounds like a sensible recommendation to include terms used in the document. And then, do we have any other objections to having a recommendation about saying something about community wealth building, even if we're not using that exact phrase? We happy with that as a recommendation? Yeah, cool. Anything else?
Just with the forward, just to emphasise, I don't think this is the term we should use, but the intersectionality aspects of this, just to make sure it's in the forward then. Thanks.
Yeah, everyone happy with that? Cool. Have you got enough detail on it? Is that this?
So yeah.
Yeah.
5, I think.
Okay, that's 5 recommendations. Are there any more? No. In that case, thank you, Susan, Caroline, Lucy, Claire, for coming and talking to us and being very helpful. We'll move on to the final item. So for this one, we're going to have we're going to try and discuss as much as possible in public session, but we might need to move into private session if we're going to talk about anything mentioned in appendices 2, 3, 4 and 7. And we also have Jamie Slagle here to address the committee for up to 5 minutes. But before Jamie does that, can Councillor Mkonge, Peter Matthew and Ian Brooke please introduce the report? Whenever you're ready, do go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to introduce the report, and I'm going to invite Peter, Ian to come in. Just want to acknowledge as well, we have Emma Jackman to advise, obviously, for the recommendation. As you know, this has been a legal process that the council has passed through. First of all, I just want to thank the officers for the work that they have done. It hasn't been easy. Initially, we had 9 potential bidders that we engaged with together with the internal comparator, other team working on the in-house. So when the conversation progressed, we narrowed down to 5 bidders that did bid for work. After further conversation, we narrowed it to 3, and now there's recommendation for 1. I must remind and acknowledge that, ever since this process, decisions have been changing according to the conversation that we have been having and what we wanted as a council in line with our thriving strategy. I just want to remind members that while other local authorities closing their centers and swimming pools, I'm glad that the decision we have reached to means we're not going to close any of our leisure centers and our swimming pool. Just been reading today that Surrey District Council are going to close their swimming pools and cut on their sports grounds. Another thing to consider here is that the industry of leisure and swimming pools hasn't improved to pre-pandemic. A lot of councils, private providers are struggling to have this industry going. That's why we've been lobbying in the past, and we're still now, for the government to invest more or to give local authorities money to, to supplement on the increasing energy costs. Also, this is a legal process that the council passed through. So we must respect our due diligence, the work they have done, because it involved our own legal team, the legal experts, and also external legal advice. I must also put it on record that we did all this work in line with what we wanted and in our in-house provision to look like. But after throughout scoring process, unfortunately, that we couldn't afford to do that. I'll just now invite Peter to come in.
Thank you, Chair. I won't say too much. I think there's two things. I'll just clarify that the report will be asking Cabinet to approve the award of the 10-year contract for the leisure services and the ice ring and the outdoor pool to Serco Leisure Limited. But the report also actually identifies and will ask Cabinet to approve a number of very important further actions that we really will need to take in order to ensure the smooth transfer of the services in the time remaining between now and the end of March. The thing I'd like to acknowledge is that I think we are very conscious of the importance of leisure services to communities. I am certainly acknowledge the significant level of scrutiny in the procurement process that we've undertaken and the significant interest in the Cabinet report. I will call on Ian just to say a few words in a minute, and then I would like us to move to discussion. But just before I do that, I think I would like to acknowledge the effort, really big effort of a huge number of teams and individual officers who have worked to ensure that we have carried out I believe, a robust, transparent and fair process, which above all, we have had to ensure was compliant with the procurement rules and regulations. And I think the report that we will put to Cabinet next week and is before you now is underpinned by that process that we've carried out. And I think it's been a big effort for the teams to ensure that that is the outcome that we present today. I'll just call on Ian just to say a few words, and I think we will open for discussions if you agree.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, just a few bits really in relation to, we've mentioned the Thriving Community Strategy here in the meeting, and clearly this is a key part of the delivery of that, which is all about connectivity. And that's why in the report and the appendices, we go through all those different programmes we've got to tackle health inequalities and improve physical activity. Serco's bid really well laid out how they will deliver things against the council's priorities. So the things they'll do for children and young people, customer service excellence, to tackle climate. The bid includes £2.7 million of investment, so a full replacement of gym kit across all of the sites and a range of other investments. Strong and social value, retaining a really good range of concessions and implementing a 0.8% turnover good causes new fund as well. Also very strong on active transport. So I've picked up the conversation before about jargon. I was going to say healthy place shaping, but all of those connectivity points in relation to cycling, access and physical activity. And on a quality perspective, they commit to either achieving Quest Excellent. Quest is the industry standard for management of leisure facilities and sport facilities, and have committed to excellent or outstanding. So overall, really strong bid. And as Chue said at the start, that's at a time where the LGA reported last year that 40% of local authorities were closing or reducing their services, and we've had a decade of 400 pools close. So overall, we think it's a very strong bid that's been put forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. That's really useful. We'll now have Jamie Slagle. Please come up to the front, and you've got up to 5 minutes. I think Alice will let you know when you come to the end. Thanks. Sorry, no, this is the member of the public speaking.
Councillors, officers, I'm deeply concerned about the recommendation to award the City Council's leisure services contract to Serco. Their history has been filled with dishonesty, failure and immorality. I would like to say with full disclosure, I do work for the County Council and I am a regular user of the ice rink, but I stand before you today in a purely personal capacity as a very concerned resident. I'm also a very big fan of the City Council, of its work, of its thriving community strategy, of many of your officers and its goals for this contract, but I am very critical of Serco and their history. They have an appalling history of delivering public services. They've defrauded government, falsified NHS performance reports, forgotten to call 450,000 breast cancer screening patients, employed immigrants at £1 an hour, made a complete hash of the test and trace scheme, given patients the wrong blood, left inmates without running water and electricity for 2 days, breached radioactive waste responsibilities, strived to cover up sexual assault allegations against asylum seekers in their care, and so the list goes on. These are not petty disagreements. In 2013, the Serious Fraud Office found that a subsidiary to Serco devised a scheme to defraud the Ministry of Justice of 70 million quid. They're made to pay that back in addition to a £19 million fine. Serco's subsidiary admitted responsibility for 3 offences of fraud and 2 of false accounting. The NHS Support Federation said that Serco's NHS clinical contracts were associated with cost-cutting, fraud, poor management and inadequate staffing levels, which in at least one contract contributed to the deaths of 2 children. That point about staffing levels was also reiterated by the National Audit Office and the Care Quality Commission. Even Appleby, a private legal services firm, called Serco a high-risk client with a history of problems, failures, fatal errors and overcharging. I really do hope you heed those learnings. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that officers have worked extremely hard to recommend what amounts on paper to the best tender application. But actions speak louder than words, and I would trust this application as far as I can throw it. I think they do represent big financial risk, reputational risk, legal risk, and most importantly, risk to residents' health and safety. Now, technically, Serco Leisure isn't Serco, I'm aware of that, but neither was the subsidiary that took the fall for defrauding government. I think you can agree with me that they're independent on paper alone, and they will be at the whims of their parents' financial directors. Any relation should be of deep concern to this council. And within the sphere of leisure, they have their own checkered history as well. Don't worry, Stockport auditors found significant lapses in operational procedures were unsatisfactory. In Basingstoke, they ran dangerous swimming lessons with too few instructors and ignored parental complaints about those dangers. Closer to home, Cherwell District Council officers had little confidence in the current contract and Serco delivering an adequate service. They are in no way geared up for the new season. Now, you may think this is ages ago they've changed, but it was just last year in a case where a custody officer kicked a mentally unwell patient to death and the judge found that Serco were highly culpable, that the health and safety inspector found that Serco Limited were not learning from their mistakes. There are no efficiency miracles, no silver bullets. They brutally understaff, under-resource, under-deliver. I do not believe they'll safely train our staff or adequately staff our leisure centres. I don't think we can trust them. And at the end of the day, all of this puts residents and staff in harm's way. The City Council have a duty of care, a duty, in my opinion, not to appoint Serco. And they're morally wrong too. I mean, the City Council perform crucial functions, as we've heard today, looking out for many of society's most vulnerable. Asylum seekers, residents with disabilities or mental health difficulties, those fleeing domestic abuse. How can they square that with working in a company that profits from electronically tagging criminals, evicting asylum seekers, exhibiting at controversial arms trade shows, falsifying data 252 times in an NHS contract, undertook an aggressive legal campaign to cover up horrendous allegations of sexual abuse in immigrant detention centres they ran? How do you explain that to your residents? You do have a choice, because although I appreciate the challenges with leisure nationally, as this paper says, there is a financially viable alternative that meets the strategic and financial objectives. I believe it's SLM, but I'm not party to the details. You wouldn't hire as your chief operating officer someone who stole millions of pounds, whose operational failures led to loss of life, who repeatedly lied on the CV of jobs they've gotten. And so I beseech you, please don't award a contract to Serco. Thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate you coming to speak to us this evening, and we'll all take on board all of your comments whilst we consider this item. You're very welcome to stay and observe this whilst we have public discussion on it, but we might have to ask you and other people, members of the public here, to leave if we go into private session. So first of all, questions at the moment just on the public parts of this.
Sorry, can we just get the speaker's name, please?
Yes. Jamie Slagle. Okay. Let's go, James, and have you got a bunch of questions, or have you just got?
No, on this, I just was going to suggest it would be very good. We have Emma Jackman, the head of law and governance, on the call, and I think we have to be aware of our rights in terms of procurement and governance in this respect. She sent an email to councillors, or maybe to committee members, but I think it'd be good to hear from Emma.
Yeah, I think Emma is mainly here just to observe, obviously. But if Emma, if you wanted to say anything at this point, please do.
I'm happy to just reiterate the email that was sent round to committee and members early this week. I would urge councillors to consider comments that they make. Obviously, it's up to you as to what you do say, but please ensure that you are aware that you have personal liability for anything that you might say in terms of any particular organisations or individuals at this stage. I'm here to offer any advice in terms of legal issues to committee. Obviously, if we stray into that, I would suggest we go into private session, given that there is a question around legal professional privilege. But other than that, I will work with Ian and Peter to answer any questions as they arise.
Thanks. Chris Jarvis.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to start by thanking the member of the public who's come to address the committee today for firstly for coming and secondly for the comments that you've made. I've raised a series of questions about this paper in other meetings, so I'm not going to take up a huge amount of the committee's time because there's lots of other people in this room who haven't had the chance to ask questions, so I'll leave it for them. But there is one thing I wanted to ask, partially in light of the address that we've just had, but also partially in light of part of the text of the public report. So on page 194 of the public agenda, the report states that awarding to the recommended supplier would not adversely impact the council's reputation. Now, I'm sure that the member of public not wanting to speak for them would like to hear more about that in light of the comments they've made. And what I guess would like to know is whether officers or the cabinet member could explain very clearly what the grounds are for judging whether the award of a contract would adversely affect the council's reputation, what the threshold for that is, and what steps have been taken to assess whether this recommendation would do so.
Thanks.
I would defer that to Emma.
Yes, Emma, yeah, to go ahead.
Sorry, bear with me. So I'm only going to talk in public session generally. So I'm happy to outline to the committee procurement law. So procurement law is governed by the Public Contract Regulations 2015. They flow down from European legislation. Their primary purpose is to ensure that no bidders are prevented from accessing the market and that there's transparency and fairness in any award of a contract by a public authority, subject to financial limits that are reviewed each year. Within the legislation, there are a number, there is a set of provisions that concern disqualifying tenderers from a process. Now, just to emphasise, obviously, they are quite tightly controlled because the whole premise of the legislation is to ensure that entities aren't barred from bidding unless on very good grounds. It is not a mandatory ground for exclusion, it wouldn't come under that. Mandatory grounds for exclusion are successful prosecutions or for offences by the company in question. And when I say the company in question, I mean the legal entity that is bidding, not any of its subsidiaries or its parent company or its group company, unless they are directly involved as part of the bidding contract. In addition to that, there are also discretionary grounds under the legislation. In terms of those discretionary grounds, there are none that relate to the reputation of the council or the public body directly. There are some that may go to what you might consider the reputation of the entity. However, to then rely upon those, the council has to have gathered and demonstrated very clearly that there is an issue under one of those discretionary grounds. And then on top of that, there are then provisions concerning something called self-cleansing, because at the start of any procurement process, every bidder will certify that they know of, and there are no mandatory or discretionary grounds for exclusion. And as such, you give them that opportunity, you rely on that to the point of award, and then there is this process for self-cleansing even if there were an issue. So that's the law generally. It's very complex. Obviously, to go into it in any more detail is you're talking real specialists in terms of procurement law. So that's sort of the general position. In terms of anything specific, I would want to give that advice in closed session.
Thanks. Shyster, and then Mike will have you after.
So again, I'd just like to thank the member of the public, Jamie, for coming in and addressing the elephant in the room, which needs to be addressed and named. So I appreciate you having the courage to come here and doing so. So I think the problem here is that, yes, there is procurement law and there is the law that must be followed. And then there is also values and there is the moral case here. And the council can tell us that these there are many different versions and entities of Serco, which is factually correct. However, the question that Councillor Jarvis asked about as well was around reputational risk to this council and the potential damage of being associated with an entity that has a very long and checkered track record as an organisation in its entity with that name. And given that this council says that it wants to ensure that Oxford is a city of sanctuary, and it's gone on record since the racist murder in the USA of George Floyd, that it wants to become an anti-racist city, then I think that these two issues do have to be factored in terms of the wider connotations of Serco and the reputational risk to this council in relation to that, and also explaining this to the wider public as well. One other point I'd like to make is the process. I do very much appreciate this has been a very complex and challenging piece of work for officers, and there's been lots of moving goalposts that has made this more complicated than perhaps anybody wanted it to be. However, I don't think there's been enough transparency on this process for members. There's been a lot of information that's been given to us very last minute, and really I think we should have been given more information sooner. And on that, the fact that we've received a note in relation to this meeting at 2:15 today, that could have been sent much earlier as well. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that there's any reason for that note being sent late, but I'm just saying that given that this is such a contentious issue, that I think, we could have been given more information sooner than we have been. So my main point here is that around reputational risk to the council in connection to being a city of sanctuary and an anti-racist city, I would like to know what thinking has been done by officers to be able to respond to that.
I'm just going to let Emma come in here.
Apologies, I did miss that element of the question from Councillor Jarvis, and so I'll answer it in response to Councillor Aziz too. So I don't mean to give members a potted rundown of procurement law, but essentially, when you run a procurement, you can you have to set criteria against which you are judging the bids that come in, and they have to be objectively measured, capable of being objectively measured. They have to be published, they have to be transparent, and once you set them, they are the criteria. You can split them between quality and financials, and you can give different weighting depending on whether you want a contract that you give more weight to quality or more weight to cost. The possible impact on the reputation of the council isn't a criteria. It's not something that can be put in a public procurement document. And if you are looking to introduce a criteria that focuses on the an individual bidder, or that might potentially, because of the council's views on them, discriminate against that bidder, then you are going against the sort of spirit and the requirements of the legislation by looking to potentially restrict that bidder from going through that process. To stress again, the whole point of the legislation is that no bidder should be prevented from bidding other than in exceptional circumstances. And the way for a public body to manage the impact upon its reputation from any contract is through proper contract management post-award.
I think, yeah, okay, try to do.
So I mean this very respectfully, Officer. You're talking at me about procurement law. That's not my question. My question is about the potential reputational risk to this council, given that it talks about its values of wanting to be a city of sanctuary and wanting to be an anti-racist city, and given the wider, very problematic reputation of this organisation, this company that's put the bid in, which I understand is you're saying there's different entities to it, but I'm not even sure this is really a question for you, and I mean that very respectfully. It's more a question, I think, for political members, and what kind of input was taken from us, because I raised this when I was a cabinet member many times. I never got a response then. I'm not getting one now. I'm not a cabinet member now. So yeah, I don't think this can be answered in relation to specifically talking about procurement law.
I think Chewy's going to come in to respond to that.
Thanks, Ashta. I appreciate the work you have done, and you and I both worked on the thriving strategy, and basically we know what our leisure futures did really want. In terms of what you're raising a very important issue. Birmingham is a center of sanctuary, but SECO does run their leisure services. It also depends on the public realm, public interpretation of it. I've received a lot of emails. Only a few of them have been critical of SECO. I think people, what they are looking for actually is things like opening hours, things like having a discussion of what SECO is really going to provide, and what is the future looking like from 1st of April when the leisure contract gets into force. Things like how are we going to manage them? How are we going to make them accountable? And there's a question of inviting SECO, for example, to have a public meeting so that people can ask them questions. I'm going to bring in later Ian to just explain a little bit of due diligence, what we passed through, because obviously we did go for references and we got those references back. One point you have raised about receiving the note late, I do apologize for that. As you can imagine, this is a very intense work, and we are getting some of the responses from outside consultation, because we had to bring in external advice, both legal, who are more competent in the procurement of legal services, for example. So it's intense work, and sometimes we do deliver the notes quite late. So at this moment, I will just invite Ian to just come in to talk about the due diligence that we did. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherie. So at the onset of the process, we sought references from the bidders. So they were formal references from, this is my counterparts in different local authorities. Serco's references came back very strong in relation to delivery, and we then followed that up with conversations, direct conversations with organisations. So Serco deliver all of Sport England's centres of excellence. I've spoke with a chap called Steve Welch, who's the client lead for Sport England, who is full of praise for the delivery, the operational delivery of Serco for their centres of excellence. They also operate Stoke Mandeville, not too far from Oxford, which they've done for a number of years, and they've got a good reputation there. And Serco have also last week won a contract in Buckinghamshire to operate centres such as Aquavale. So that's a new contract they've won. I don't think they have operated in Cherwell before, and I think it was mentioned my hometown of Stockport. It was good to hear. So I don't think that they have any recent concerns, and I think the only ones that we came across were over a decade ago. So lots of due diligence, lots of conversations with different places to understand deliverability. Of course, every operator has got contracts that are less positive for a number of reasons, but overall the due diligence didn't flag any, just go back to the language before, any significant areas of concern or any areas of concern in relation to their delivery of leisure services. Thank you, Cherie.
Thanks. I think I'd be keen to come back to this maybe when we're in private session, because I have a question about one of the appendices that is a confidential one. So maybe we can return to this discussion, but for now I'll go to Mike.
Thanks, Chair. At the risk of maybe being slightly inappropriate, I've been reminded through the discussion of that a Gilbert and Sullivan song when the protagonist does all sorts of outrageous things and ends every verse, "I'll start another company at once." And capitalism hasn't changed very much in the last 150 years. And given that, I'm not quite sure how far we will get by questioning as far as I can see, very thorough procurement law and due diligence process that has been gone through. However, there are some quite cogent concerns have been raised, and I think under paragraph 48(3), we talk about establishing internal arrangements to ensure the leisure service contract is effectively managed. As we know, in the existing leisure service contract, that's taken quite a lot of time and effort from some very good officers and has not always been successful. So, and it's not, we're talking about 3.5 months. What, 3.5 months? Maybe much. No, 2.5 months until the new leisure service contract starts. So that is now quite urgent, and it would be good to know when the process of establishing those arrangements will be complete, and whether information can come back to this committee, even in email form, about hopefully containing reassurance about how that will be done and how it will be done differently to the way the fusion contract was managed. So the second question I have, which should be easier to answer, is on paragraph 39, which on the face of it looks like a doubling of a potential maximum doubling of pay-as-you-go rates for certain services. The adult gym was mentioned, and I know that social prescribers in my own ward, and no doubt in some others, often prescribe exactly that as exercise for sometimes people who usually aren't very well off and need that as part of their health regime. I'd be if the concessionary rate is going to go up that much, it would be good to know what can be done to mitigate that. Sorry, that was waffling on a little bit.
Chewy?
Thank you. I'll refer those to questions for paragraph 48, subsection 3 and 39 to Ian to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rowley and good Chewy. So just on the first point, which is in relation to the previous contract with Fusion and the standards deteriorating, and what can we do to ensure that those things don't happen within this contract? I think there's a number of things, Councillor Rowley, that we are implementing. We would be putting in a strengthened client function. So you'll see in the budget proposals a new role across leisure and community centres in relation to property and asset clienting, which I think will be really important. We've also reviewed a defaults regime. So clearly we want to work with the operator in partnership to make sure things get done. But the other side of that is the stick. And there is an updated defaults regime in place to ensure that if things don't happen, there's a direct payment. As part of the competitive dialogue process, we had conversations in relation to finding out whether there are other places that payments hadn't been made to local authorities. Outside of the pandemic, we didn't find that was the case with Serco. We found that they were able to keep up their payments, actually more than the other operators, because of that broader portfolio. And I think absolutely good point, Councillor Rowley, in relation to the adult gym price. We have also picked that up and had conversations in relation to reviewing that I think it's £5.60 price. Serco's view on it was that they've got a very competitive monthly payment price. So the £5.60 is pay as you play. They've got competitive monthly payment, which works out far better if someone's coming more than 1.5 times a week on a value for money basis. But we have said we would want to review that. And within the report, we mentioned there's a few things that we would need to negotiate, which is really common with such a broad contract before we go live. We've also, and I also mentioned previously, Councillor Rowley, the range of activities. So you move together, the inclusive, mainly free activities that we operate through the leisure centres. They are really linked to social prescribing. So across the sites, and in particular the Leeds, we're making some really good progress with health colleagues, with Debbie, the local social prescriber, to get more people active who wouldn't be previously. And then the final point to that, Councillor Rowley, would be alongside that, there's this new 0.8% turnover, which is 59,000 a year, to invest in inclusive access. So it is a change from the previous concessions, but overall I think it's a very competitive concessions with additional things added in. And also in the council's budget, there is £52,000 for a coordinator for those activity programmes for next year as well.
Quickly, Chair. Sorry, a very quick question. Are we confident that the contractual penalties you mentioned are robust? In other words, can we rule out a situation where the provider finds it's cheaper to let things slip and just pay the fine?
I don't know who would... Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Sorry, Chair, I should have waited. No is a simple answer, Councillor Rowley, that it won't be more beneficial for them to let things slide, because in essence the defaults ramp up. So by letting things ride, the defaults ramp up, and then they get hit harder by the cost that they have to pay.
Thanks. Chris Moulton.
Thanks, Chair. Somewhat related, since Councillor Rowley's talking about obligations to provide services, where are we on obligations to pay the projected management fees that the various bidders, whoever gets accepted, has been projected over the coming 5 years? To what degree are they obliged to pay the numbers that have been put down there? Are those numbers just indicative and they're obliged to the total amount over the 5 years? But basically, yeah, what is their obligation to pay management fees, and what is our recourse if they are not paid to the level that we are anticipating?
I would defer to Ian again.
Thank you, Chire. So the fees that are stated in the confidential appendices are contractual. So that's the Serco are committed to make those payments across the 10 years of the contract. And it's the same point in relation to we tested all of the bidders in relation to their history of making those payments. And as I said previously, Serco had a very strong history of making payments. If they're not made and the preferred bidder goes into decline for whatever reason, then there's a range of recourse, such as chasing, negotiations, and the end of that line will be a conversation with my colleague who's on my right, Emma, in relation to legal recourse at the end of that process. Clearly, we won't want to jump to that, but that's how that would flow through.
Thanks. Are there any more public questions? Yeah, Altaf.
There's a lot of talk about the procurement law, and that in a way scares to ask anything. But I think whoever the bidder is and whoever the successful is, but isn't that is going to be the final decision, Chewy, you and your cabinet member? And if you are, then I think we should put this on record that you are going to be responsible of whether it's a good decision or bad decision. And this must be go on record. And when it comes to recommendation, I will try to make a recommendation as well. But my second question is, if this contract is 10 years, that means including ice rink. So that means for next 10 years, there's no get out clause and the old ice rink and that area will stay same. So that means the council have less ability to do anything, say building another ice rink and doing something in the center where is a very important place, where ice rink can be somewhere else. So that means that we are stuck here for 10 years. So what is happening on that? So that's the two area of it.
Thanks, Ataf. I'll give it a shot if I'm wrong, and Emma is going to correct me on this. Firstly, as a cabinet member on this project, as you can see in the paper, after the cabinet meeting, I'll be tasked to finalize the contract. Actually, so a lot of work need to be done. In terms of what you have said on your second point, I think that is trace to the negotiation that we are going to have with a bidder. So after the authorization, we are going to have further work now to finalize the contract. So what you have raised is what we are going to be discussing. What happens? What our obligation? What's the obligation? What amount of funds, for example? Thank you. And Ian on the ice rink will come in.
Thank you, Chire. So on that, I'll come to you in a second, if that's okay. So on the, are we locked into the contract? And if there's failure, what do we do? There's a number of schedules in the contract. I've talked about the default schedule. One of them is about breakage as well. So there are certain remedies in there that I can go through in the confidential session if required, that mean the council's got the ability to break the contract if the performance isn't at the level. Clearly, that's not a very quick, simple process. It has to be regular failings, but there are certain mechanisms that are in the contract within that schedule in relation to how that moves forward. And on the second point in relation to sorry, Chewy, what was that one again? Sorry, it's just flown out my head. Sorry.
Just the ice rink.
Okay. Sorry, Chewy. So with the ice rink, clearly there is work underway on the future of the ice rink, but that's got a long way to go to get a firm fix on where that's going to be. So if you've got a date for a facility being taken out, you can tie it into the contract and you can model that in. If it's fluid, you don't know where it is, there are certain schedules and remedies that are in place that will then work through any changes in the future. But because we don't know exactly what's going to happen there, it's not able to have a specific schedule or clause that details what would happen with that. So it's a general clause about if a facility came out, this is how this will be worked through. And so that is considered within the contract schedules.
Thanks. Any further questions, Imogen? And then Chris, do you want to go straight after?
Mine's a comment rather than a question, so
okay.
Let's do it separately.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And also I'd like to echo the thanks to Jamie. This committee, in my experience, doesn't get many public representations. And I suppose that kind of points to how strongly people feel about this issue and how important it is that we get it right. Emma, you talked about the reputational risk not being a valid, in procurement law, not being a valid criterion. I was wondering about the social value weighting and our status as a city of sanctuary. And my presumption would be that it would be valid to that part of the weighting. And a follow-up question on that. So is that true? Could you elaborate on that? A follow-up question to that is that I believe 10% is the minimum social value weighting we have in our procurement policy. I know this committee has really pushed for higher social value weightings in the past. I was wondering why it was 10% and not higher. Thank you.
I think those might have been for Emma largely, but Chue, if you want to come in first, please do.
I would defer to Ian.
Okay, Ian.
Okay, thank you, Chue. So we worked through the overall criteria, and again at the start of the process had conversations, spoke to FMG who were supporting us as the external consultants. Lots of places we're going out for their leisure contract and weighting cost higher than quality. The council considered what we want to do, and it rated quality at 60% and cost at 40%. So within that broader quality, those quality criteria, we do have social value at the percentage that you've been through, but we also have inclusion, we have accessibility, we have EDI. So we've got a suite of criteria that link to and speak to the social value. Social value, we then ask for specific case studies to see how that can be demonstrated, and in one of the confidential appendices, Serco have put numbers next to that and then detailed in relation to some of the delivery. So we really angst actually about how do we work on that 60% to make sure it captures those broader elements of equality, diversity, inclusion, social value, accessibility, making sure the pricing is inclusive, concessions. So that's why that percentage wasn't increased within the bid, but we think we had an overall really strong framework within the criteria, which is shown as what I think within the Appendix 1.
Maybe Emma can ask her answer about City of Sanctuary being part of the social value metric.
Yeah, so social value in terms of the Enabling Act is essentially using procurement to get benefit for the locality. And when you run a procurement process, you generally share with bidders the themes that you'd like them to bid along, or you give them some guidance, but ultimately it's up to bidders to put forward how they would deliver social value. I've not been involved in evaluation, so I don't know the details in terms of what was in the criteria for social value and what the proposals were, but there is the possibility you can ask it to look at that theme, but as to what the proposal is that comes forward, that's very much up to the bidders, and then you evaluate it based on what comes forward. I don't know if that answers the question for you.
I think that sort of probably answers the question, unless, yeah, as much as we perhaps can here. Chris, do you want to make your comment?
Thank you, Chair. Since it seemed we're spiraling the drain of private session, then it'd be worth saying a few words whilst the members of the public are still present about the crucial question, I suppose, is what eventually, if anything, does this committee want to recommend to Cabinet in terms of its forthcoming decision? And the tempting thing, obviously, is to write a recommendation to Cabinet saying down with Serco. And my personal view, and which I would recommend to the committee, is that essentially we need to admit that we're snookered, that we're in a three-way bind here between one, accepting Serco's bid with the downsides that have been discussed at length today, two, appointing a different bidder with the high risk, as has been described to us at length, that we are taken to a and successfully legally challenged with potentially enormous financial consequences for the council, or three, aborting the procedure entirely, which would require us to either run leisure services ourselves or to induce Fusion to run leisure services for us, also with potentially disastrous financial consequences for the council. So in view of the fact that choices 2 and 3 are really awful choices, for that reason, I wouldn't want to myself recommend that the council takes those options, even though it is tempting to do so.
Chue?
Thanks, Chris. I mean, we have had a very difficult work that we did. When the whole process started, actually, I didn't emphasize that, you know, the bidder at the moment will be the successful bidder. We're all looking personally to bring it in-house, but it's not visible. It's not, you know, Chris, we can't manage it according to the scoring criteria. It's important to know that none of our leisure centers or swimming pool was going to close. Most of our other councils are going bust. It's quite important to recognize the work of the administration, the work of the officers, that we have got financial sound, though we are not out of the woods yet. Very, very important to acknowledge that. Thank you.
Perhaps this is a good point to say yes, Shyster.
So Councillor Smoten, thank you for your contribution there, which I do agree with you with overwhelmingly. I think for me, one of the lessons in all of this really is around the fact that Oxford is one of the most unequal cities in the whole of the UK. We have massive levels of poverty and deprivation in a city as wealthy as this. So this council frequently talks about Oxford being an international city of prestige, which it is. However, our work is primarily with the residents of this city and the people who live here. So one of the lessons I would like to be taken forward from this work on leisure is when it comes to things like housing, our hands are tied. We cannot build more housing. We do not have the means to do that. So where we do have the means to create better equity for our residents and to ensure that there is much more opportunity for community wealth building, for the incredible organisations across our city who do wonderful work to be involved in ensuring that private companies are not actually taking more and more of our public services, we should be working harder to make that happen. And I also understand that to do that, we need greater resource in the council. So I do understand that as well. But I do think that we need to really start getting very serious about improving equity in this city where, like I said, the rising levels of poverty and deprivation are, you know, the bread and butter of what we're dealing with every day as council and as councillors. So I just want to say, I said it to the council leader earlier, we need to be far more ambitious. I am seeing lots of nice words put on documents. I've been responsible for producing those documents as well. I'm not extracting myself from that. But what I'm saying is, one of the reasons why some of us around this table have such strong views on this issue, which we should have, is precisely for the reasons I'm outlining here. So that would be one of my pleas in terms of, you know, lessons learned from this process. Thank you.
At this point, can we just gauge if we do want to go into private session or not at some point? Not saying it has to happen right now, but do we want to or not?
I have a question that might be able to raise in the session.
don't think it's helpful.
Yeah, does anyone else have a strong desire that we do go into it? Does he?
No, I was just putting my hand up to speak now.
Okay, cool. In that case, then let's just carry on and then we'll come back to recommendations. Lizzie?
Yeah, I just wanted to put a voice in the other direction. I mean, in a more positive tone than Chris over but one, which is that I think I agree with a lot of what Councillor Aziz has said, and I think that's why, and I have listened to all of the advice that we've had from Emma Jackson and about the law and how procurement law works, and I think that what the council and what officers and cabinet member have put together is something that will enable us to have that impact here in Oxford in terms of having the impact on local residents, because the impact that local residents is surely going to see is the fact that their leisure centres are staying open and seeing more investment. And I think that's actually something that we should be, I mean, we can have the political discussion all we like about different companies, but I think from the perspective of people in Oxford, what they're seeing is that there's leisure centres staying open, and that's, I think, going to have the biggest measurable impact. But that's just, so I guess if we're thinking about recommendations for future, that's my perspective on it.
Okay, Chris, do you want to try and carefully phrase your question?
I'll be as careful as I can. And please do anyone interject if you think that I'm straying into things that need to be in confidential session. So I'm looking at page 191 of the public agenda, and I'm looking at paragraph 21. And in this section, it's where the report lays out what it describes as being the high costs of the in-house proposal and where these result from. Now, I'm going to refer to things that are in the confidential paper without mentioning the detail. I want to check if I'm able to do that in public session. And by referring to them, what I mean is that there is a difference in the list of these 4 things that are listed in paragraph 21 and some of the detail in, I think, appendix 4. The question I have really on this is, why is there a difference? And how much of the detail that is in appendix 4 in relation to the in-house proposal needs to be confidential, because the way that I compare those two areas at the moment appears to me slightly dishonest, unless there's very, very strong justification as to why there are additional things listed in the confidential paper that are not listed in that list of 4.
Thanks, Chris. I would defer that to Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chris. I think there's 2 parts to that, isn't there? So you could make a recommendation in relation to be more explicit in the report in relation to staffing costs. I think that's comes to what you're referring to within the points. Yeah. And I think that's a fair recommendation, and I think those things probably should marry up. And the in-house bid, we've made that confidential on the basis that, so all of the bidders put their bids in and the information comes under a confidential heading, commercially confidential. So all the detail of that they're very sensitive about. Now, the questions before in relation to schedules and what if the contract doesn't deliver its promise and there are problems and it doesn't work. Now, the in-house team may need to revisit that bid, and parts of that may be commercially sensitive in a market opportunity further down the line. That's why in-house teams tend to keep the bid that they put together as commercially sensitive to future-proof that and use that rather than giving that directly to the market. So that's why the in-house bid is classified as commercially sensitive. What we have tried to do is pull out key parts of that within the report and demonstrate those in the report to kind of bring that to life as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, Chris.
Thanks, Ian. That's incredibly helpful. I guess I would like to propose a recommendation that that the council I don't know how to phrase this, but publishes a more detailed breakdown of the higher costs in relation to the in-house provider, particularly in relation to expenditure and staffing.
Yeah, that's we can come back to it, but that sounds like a good one. I think I'm going to try and carefully phrase a question now, which is when we've looked at the financial assessment of the in-house option versus the other options, has there been consideration of the fact that in the longer term, if it was run in-house, profits can obviously be reinvested in services, whereas if we are taking it out, if it's being run by Serco or by anybody else, obviously any money that would be a profit would not be getting reinvested. And to what extent has that been taken into account when looking at the financial assessment of all of the options?
Thanks. I'm just going to answer just one word, affordability. So we couldn't afford it, but Ian again will be able to go in more details.
Yeah, so when we started the process, and Cherie mentioned at the start, there is a real clear work plan on the in-house bid to make sure it was well resourced. We put it together, we did a lot of work, and clearly we were trying to find a solution, an innovative solution that we could knit together that could be, I'm not sure profitable, but financially viable, and certainly within the MTFP. So we weren't able to do that, and that wasn't from certainly from a lack of trying. And if we were able to do that, then that surplus, in the same way we operate our housing company or ODS, absolutely then goes back into services. It was just a very long way from being at all viable in this case, and therefore what the council gets would be the opposite of that. So not a surplus or profit, it would have the higher costs and also retain all of the risk for achieving that. So the likelihood is the opposite of the intention about can we get a profitable service that can then reinvest. It would probably be, or highly likely, it would certainly be a higher cost and would probably also be a high risk liability on an annual basis in relation to eating into the council's budget, and therefore structuring it into a long-term contract gives the council stability, certainly in relation to the deliverability, and therefore aids our budgeting. But it was certainly considered in Cherie and I's conversations at the start of this process.
Thanks. Other questions? Or do we want to start thinking about recommendations? We obviously had Chris's just then, and I think we had one from Mike around having an update on transitional agreements to be given to scrutiny. Was that what you were trying to get at?
Yes, please. Even if it's only in written form, I think it would be good to see it and to be able to have confidence in it.
Yeah, is everyone happy with that? Yeah, Chris Mount.
A couple of possibilities. One that jumps immediately to mind is around the matter of time. One of the options of abandoning and retendering was rendered especially difficult due to time. So it seems to me a good recommendation would be that in future procurement exercises, all measures are taken to ensure that it is conducted sufficiently in advance, that option is meaningfully available to the council if there was a desire to retender with more nuanced requirements, or indeed for any other reason. The second one we might conceivably make is, so some of the panel won't have been present. Yesterday there was another discussion about this that was with group leaders, and a lot of things discussed there came down to ways that you might reasonably wish to assess a bidder, but which are not permitted. So as well as stuff around transparency. So for example, a reasonable question to me would seem, is it possible for councillors to look over the submissions to the qualitative questions? And the answer was that legally, no, we are not. And I would agree, it's been said a couple of times today, that that is a shortcoming in terms of transparency, that no other organisation would work that way. It might not be routine for people in certain roles to look at that information, but generally speaking, councillors they might be bound to confidentiality, but they would be able to see that information, whereas we are bound not to. So all of anything along these lines, we'd have to be recommending essentially that the council makes representations to government, or makes representation to governments, plural, since that's likely to be the case this year. That there should be greater transparency and ability for councillors to review those responses, obviously without introducing the opportunity for us to be capricious. That's what the law is trying to prevent, but it is currently also preventing us from being informed. There are other things along those lines to do with corporate structure, for example, using certain structures which enable, let's say, tax optimization, that prevents us from distinguishing between sort of social enterprise bidders and fully commercial bidders, which personally I would see as quite desirable, but again, which we're currently prevented from doing so. I could go on, I probably shouldn't, but I suggest it's a genre of recommendation is things where it is a shortcoming of the process that this council doesn't have control over, but which government does have control over.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, you raise a very, very important point there, because even myself, I wasn't involved because of our procurement law and the process, but I believe it was transparent. We had, for example, for scoring, we had different staff working on the scoring process for the different bidder and the in-house. I just wanted to refer to Emma to comment on this, because it would be very good for councillors actually to get involved, to review the questions and to have an input in the procurement process. But does it mean we have to change the constitutions, our constitutions, or? But I mean, Emma can come in, but that's a very valid point, Chris. Thank you.
I'm partly just thinking about time. Maybe we could make the recommendation, and Cabinet can, when they respond to it, can talk to Emma and decide what is they can tell us if things aren't allowed. But would there be agreement on that as a recommendation, that we ask Chue or Susan or somebody to write to government to allow greater transparency in procurement process and a greater ability to sort of assess fairness and social responsibility within procurement process? Yeah. Imogen.
On that point, and it is a bit frustrating for me because I've actually been making these points about transparency for a couple of years now. I'd like to make a recommendation that I made 2 years ago, that we publish indicative evaluation the plural of matrix, matrices. Yeah, matrices, it is, isn't it? Yeah, let's get all Greek for a second. Because I think it would be in the public interest to have just, this is what it might look like. It would also help us as a council to go, you know, this is best practice, this is what we're looking for. Would be an opportunity on a website to say, we're going to, you know, try and submit a bid that, you know, captures these things that this council is all about. And also it would just be an opportunity for the public to understand this process before it's too late. For committee, for members to have some engagement, even though they can't in the detail. And I also, part of the recommendation I made 2 years ago was that the council publishes a description of the principles that determine its social value weightings in contract tenders. So I think I'd like to make that recommendation again, because I personally haven't seen the fruits of it.
Yeah, have we got any objections to that? I mean, Chue, you can respond if you want, but
yes, I just want to just make a small point, and I think this is the committee to think about. I think it's important you come up with a threshold of how much that needs to get involved into the council if you want to get involved into the procurement process, because you know you've been inundated with a lot of queries for things like 30,000 or so. I must suggest that you come up with a figure that is material to go for if you want to get involved in the procurement process.
On the actual recommendation, is everyone happy with that? Yeah.
Can I speak?
Is it a recommendation or is it on this one?
Yeah, recommendation.
Okay, yeah, I'm just going to make one and then Lubna and then you, I think, in terms of them.
Okay.
I was going to recommend that maybe as a way of responding to some of the things that issues that we've had have been raised here, perhaps we could ask Cabinet to ask Serco if they are given the contract, if they could give a response to councillors, explicitly responding to the concerns that have been raised in this meeting and other meetings, and ask them to make a statement on them if they are given the contract. Would we be happy to have that as a recommendation? Yeah. Okay. Lubna, or were you responding on this one?
Joy, at the beginning of this.
Shyster, if you just put your microphone on.
Sorry. Apologies. Yeah, I think you said that Serco were willing to have a discussion or something, Q&A with councillors. So I would like that recommendation to be put down, that we don't just want it in writing, we want an opportunity to have a Q&A with them, please. Thank you.
Yeah, should we request something in writing and a Q&A? Lubna.
Hi, Chair. This isn't a recommendation, but it was rather questions. Am I allowed to ask at this point?
Yeah, go ahead, ask. Yeah.
So it's 3 questions. The first question was the person who's, I've forgotten name, sorry. Jamie has done a public address. Is there going to be a response given to him, or he has no from the Cabinet or from here?
Don't think that there's a process for responding.
Legal, would you like to intervene?
I think that we have taken into account the address, and that is the response. There isn't a formal response like in full council.
But we could ask. There is.
We could ask. Yeah. Do we want to recommend that there is? Okay. Yes. Let's have that as another recommendation then.
The second question was with relation to, like you buy a garment or you make a deal with someone through negotiations, and you have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Is there anything like that as part of this? No?
Have we covered that in the question about like ways
procurement.
of getting out of the contract?
Legal?
I think Ian might have.
Yes, it's a contract.
It's part of the contract. So that's the second question. And then the third question is with relation to, the due diligence. When officers went, did they physically go to the areas that Ian mentioned during this process, like Buckinghamshire, Hampshire, Birmingham, and did their due diligence on the ground? Or was this given by statistics, facts, and reviews? That's my.
I would refer you to Ian, but in terms of the negotiation, in terms of when we got to nitty-gritty of the contract, I also, as a cabinet member, do secret shopping, but I would refer that to Ian.
Yeah,
well, absolutely, Chair. So it was a mix because we contacted so many places. We didn't fancy going up to Gateshead, but we had a really good conversation with Gateshead. Whereas some of the more local places, we have done actual visits, and some of the London boroughs we've done visits to. So it's a real mix, and it seems to have worked well for expedience in relation to using it online and going in person to also get under the skin of how the operators work.
Altaf, are there any other recommendations, or will we then be done once we've had your one? Is that
second
good?
Question left? Answer.
Sorry. Oh, have you not?
I didn't get the answer for the second question. I didn't get the answer for the second question.
It was the money back guarantee.
So in terms of this particular contract, the council is not actually paying any money under it. We're actually receiving a management fee back in. And there are no provisions in terms of consumer protection where you have a right to terminate within a certain period immediately after. There's no calling off period. You abide by the terms of the contract as published and as negotiated.
Cool.
Chair.
Alta.
Okay, we had a lot of discussions and recommendations. So it seems to me that nobody is really challenging what the challenge was. Everybody's putting recommendation, trying to go with the administration thinking. And I'm afraid what I heard this evening and on what we discussed, I think as elected member, I have a right to agree or disagree. No procurement law, no law can stop me for not agreeing something. So I can agree or disagree, and I don't agree with whatever is there. Everybody is trying to put it support in a way, but I want to put this back to the administration and Chewy and your team. You are the responsible. I won't have my name part of this because later stage I understand the way the Labour administration or Labour plays. Then, oh, it was discussed in this committee, you were there, you should have voted against it, you should have said this, you should have done like what we're trying to do, find the way around in the recommendation, then this politics will come. So we should make it very black and white clear that it is your decision, your administration, dear, and then you will be held responsible, not a person like me who doesn't agree with it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ataf. I mean, it was proactive to disagree. And, we produce the budget as the administration, you produce yours as well as the opposition, so you are entitled. But, in terms of our thinking, we have laid out the process that we have passed through. Even the process that, picking another bidder, we may face ourselves a challenge because according to the procurement law, that is the winning bid. I would be more interested for you to give me an alternative that is viable as you disagree. I mean, that would be useful as an elected member. Thank you.
I don't think we want to start another discussion after the committee left and is already 9:15. But I can discuss this, and in the budget process, obviously, we will be discussing the budget, and over my party group, we will be putting things differently, and we will discuss that then and there. But as far as what I'm saying, that this is a purely a administration and cabinet decision where the committee have discussed, and some people made some recommendation, and people like me are no part of that. Thank you.
One thing I must point out, Ataf, you are right in what you are saying. We are elected members. We have got the civil servants. It's the civil servants, it's the officers that produce the recommendation. It's not our decision, but we agree with what
I'm sorry, it is your decision.
Yeah, it's my decision. Yeah.
Oh, you're politically in charge. And can I just back up what Councillor Altaf Khan has said? I think it's really important for the records of this meeting to show that there is grave concern from members of the Scrutiny Committee around the process. We've talked at great length. I'm not going to go through all of it again. However, we don't actually have voting rights, sadly, on this. If we did, then I think it's fairly obvious which way this would go. But I think this is really important that this is noted correctly, that we have very serious concerns and we've raised them at great length as a member of the public. And I do think the way this has come about has been very unfortunate. And also the way a press release was put out and everything else, and media coverage and all of that, just given it's such a contentious issue, it shouldn't have happened in this way.
Yeah, Chris.
Thank you. Sorry to keep talking, but just to build on that and to pick up on a lot of the front end of this conversation. This may have been picked up in other recommendations that I may not have tracked, but I think what Councillor Aziz there, described was what I think has been I think everyone who's been involved in conversation over the last 8 days, officers, cabinet members, opposition members and so on, would not describe the process as having been particularly enjoyable or pleasant. It's been quite a frustrating and difficult process for elected members to have been through. And so I feel like taking a step aside from the immediate thing that's going to be going to cabinet next week or whenever the date is, thinking about how this process is managed going forward, I think there's been very clear vocalisation, both in this meeting and in other spaces, that there is a lot of unhappiness and frustration about the degree to which members have been involved, informed and consulted as part of this process. And I wonder whether there's a recommendation that we can make a scrutiny committee that collectively we think that there needs to be a review of the process on these types of large-scale tendering and procurement processes, whereby there is a greater degree of, at the very least, information provided to members and involvement in that way.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing lots of nods, so I think that's a good recommendation. Yeah. Have we got anything final to be said here? We do still have some sort of admin-y bits to go through at the end, but if anyone wants to say anything final. No? Oh, Shyster.
Okay, so I think also this exercise has been really heavily focused on procurement law, and absolutely the law has to be abided by. Nobody is disagreeing with that. However, our challenges and questions have been mostly, the responses have been really focused back on the issue of the law, and that's not what some of our questions and some of the discussion around this committee has been this evening. And I think for me, myself, I have been very uncomfortable in some of the ways that this, the lack of responses and the way that they've been given have all been focused on the law. That's not, for me, acceptable. That's not actually answering the questions that I'm trying to get answers to. So I'd like there to be something noted about that as well. This is a very complex issue. We understand that, but in order for democratically elected members to be able to ask questions in the way that we need to, we need to get responses that don't just keep referring us back to the law, because that's not answering our questions.
Do you want, I mean, that will be minuted as a comment. Do you want, is that
as a comment, yeah.
Is that acceptable? Okay. Chire, I mean, I'm not, at this point, I feel like there's not a huge amount that can potentially be added to this conversation. But if you want to make a very quick comment.
Just a quick comment. I mean, just want to thank each and everyone. I mean, this is a complicated issue, and we value your feedback or your input, and it's going to be taken into consideration. Thank you to all. Thank you.
I mean, I know. Can it be very brief?
Yeah, Chire, you keep saying all night, this is very difficult situation, difficult decision, but you enjoy the perks of being cabinet member and in charge, and you have to take the good and bad, both has to. If you go and say to the public, oh, I have done this, but if something goes wrong, you should be able to take that as well.
Accepted. Thank you.
Thanks. I think this has been a very useful discussion, even if maybe we haven't been satisfied with everything that we've heard this evening. We're going to run through the final. Thank you to officers, of course, and to Chire for coming and answering our questions. I'm going to hand over to Alice to run through the work plan and forward plans.
Did you want me to go through recommendations on that first?
Oh, sorry, do we want a clarification on the recommendations, or are we all happy? I think there was agreement on all of them. So, and then we can okay, Alice is going to do a whiz through.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I've got 8 recommendations total. So we've got one about the council publishing a more detailed breakdown of the higher costs in relation to the in-house provider, expenditure and staffing. An update on the transitional monitoring arrangements back to scrutiny. One about future procurement exercises. I think this has merged kind of 2 comments that were made. The latest comment by Councillor Jarvis has kind of merged into the earlier one. So basically that all measures are taken to ensure sufficient members are involved sufficiently in advance, they're planned, and I'll get some more clear wording about that. And we've got the council makes representations to government to ensure greater transparency in procurement processes, publish indicative evaluation matrices for future procurement exercises, publish the principles of social value weightings, ask Cabinet to ask Serco to respond to the public address, the concerns raised in the public address during in writing and in a Q&A, and then recommend that Cabinet responds to the public address. Sorry, no, the one about Cabinet asking Serco if they respond to the concerns raised in this meeting. So I think that was everything.
Yeah, everyone happy? Perfect.
Would you mind circulating something in writing? There's probably 1 or 2 that I might make some comment on, but I won't try and do it verbally right now. Is that okay?
Well, the normal process, they go to the chair for, but that's just a very brief overview and they will be finessed, but yes.
Work plan and forward plan, we're going to go through it very quickly because
Yes, so the work plan, forward plan are included in the agenda. The only thing that's changed is the covered market roof refurbishment item list on the forward plan for February slipped to March. So the forward plan as it's listed for February is as it is still recommended. So if the committee wants to agree it as it is for now. Yeah, so that report was on the forward plan for February, but it slipped to March. And it's just recommended that the committee agrees the reports that are listed on the work plan for February, and we'll consider March when the committee meets in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think that sounds sensible. Great. Next, we're reporting back on recommendations. Cabinet looked at recommendations made on 7 reports at its last meeting in December. I'm not going to run through the list of all of them. They are the things that we've looked at in our last 2 meetings. And some of the, but yeah, we're going to have, I think Alice is going to very quickly go through scrutiny panel updates, which we were going to get from Lizzie and James and Mike.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I can't do one from Councillor Rowley because I wasn't in attendance and it was all in confidential session, but I can cover the housing and finance panels. So the housing panel met on the 5th of December. They considered a number of reports, including building safety and compliance with an HRA stock, housing performance monitoring, housing complaint handling performance, and the City of Sanctuary accreditation. There's a lot of constructive and wide-ranging discussion, and the panel made one recommendation to Cabinet on the City of Sanctuary accreditation item, which related to the Council advocating for safe legal routes into the UK during Refugee Week and more broadly, and that linked to the lobbying element of the City of Sanctuary accreditation work. And in the interest of time, I'll move over to the finance panel. So they met on the 6th of December. And they considered a very large number of reports at that meeting, and also prepared for the budget review group process, which is currently underway. Made 3 recommendations in respect of 2 reports. So 2 recommendations on the integrated performance report for Q2 this year. The first one was about the options available to the council for reducing temporary accommodation costs, and the second recommendation was about challenging optimism bias assumptions within capital and revenue programmes, and then a recommendation in relation to the Treasury Management mid-year report on reviewing the current limit for non-specified investments in Treasury management strategy. And I think that's probably the highlights for now.
Are there any questions or comments? And if not, then can everyone just note those responses and the recommendations and the updates from the panel meetings? And if you've all done that, can you also note the dates of future meetings? And it's the end of the meeting. Thanks all for a very long
Thank you
scrutiny.
for chairing the discussion so fairly as well, Lucy.
Thank you.